Charles Darwin is on the cusp of publishing his extraordinary theory of evolution when he receives a letter.
What does he want? This Wallace chap.
I have never seen a more striking coincidence. It reads as an abstract of my work. His terms match my chapter headings. It's as if he's been reading my mind. Variations from parent species in a struggle for existence.
This letter threatens to destroy years of work which began on a 5-year voyage to the Southern Hemisphere.
Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection explains everything about life. Its complexity, its beauty, its diversity.
Darwin spends the next 20 years painstakingly gathering evidence.
Health is always affected by the mind.
He battles illness and the cruel reality of his own theory.
Annie.
But on the other side of the world, Alfred Russel Wallace has come up with an almost identical theory.
How the hell did this happen? Frankly, I wonder it didn't happen sooner.
Now, Darwin will need the help of his loyal supporters more than ever.
Without them, Darwin would not have published The Origin.
Keep him on a leash, will you?
These men will push Darwin in the race to publish one of the most extraordinary theories of our time.
Papa!
Go away, please.
But Mama told me
For the love of God, will you do as you're told? Please, just leave me be.
The arrival of Alfred Russel Wallace's letter in June 1858 has thrown Charles Darwin into a panic.
What does he want? This Wallace chap.
Just send his essay on to Lyell. Introduce him. We've been corresponding. I told him in a letter that I knew Lyell.
What else did you tell him in your letters?
He suggested he was interested in theory. He'd scribbled something out. I barely read it. What did I say? I go much further than you. I think that's what I said. And wished him the best, that's all. Wished him the best. He's the one sent me those skins of the jungle fowl from Borneo, wherever the bloody hell it was.
Charles.
I have never seen a more striking coincidence. It reads as an abstract of my work. His terms match my chapter headings. It's as if he's been reading my mind. Variations from parent species in a struggle for existence. Overpopulation. Doesn't matter the details. Not even Lyell or Hooker understand my theory, and this Wallace.
Charles, you're already so far into your book.
It doesn't matter. It isn't mine, not anymore. I must have been mad. The man has looked at nature in the same way I have. He has had the very same thoughts.
He's devastated. Darwin is an ambitious scientist. He wants to be the first. And technically, in all innocence, this man has gazumped him.
For 4 years, Alfred Russel Wallace has been earning a living in the jungles of Indonesia, collecting animal and plant specimens to sell to scientists back in England. He was also thinking about the evolution of new species.
He had converted to evolution without having a theory. It was just kind of one of the things you converted to. If you were a radical young man, you learned phrenology, you learned mesmerism, you learned evolution, you did all the heresies.
This is one of the places with the richest biodiversity in the world. He's going to go there, he's going to collect specimens, and he's going to find out the mechanism that drives evolution.
That mechanism is natural selection. Wallace glimpsed it in a moment of inspiration while suffering a malarial fever in Indonesia, and then wrote to Charles Darwin, the only naturalist he knows who's interested in the subject. Wallace's letter took 4 months to reach England and finds a highly distracted Charles Darwin. Illness is sweeping through the village of Down, and Emma fears their children are in danger.
Up to bed, and a mustard poultice. I'll come up shortly and read you a story if you like.
No, I want Mama.
I'll be up in a moment. The postman said 3 more children have gone now from the village. With the scarlet fever.
No one has scarlet fever. He's calming down. Good boy, Charles. Just for a moment.
But the Wallace letter won't wait. Darwin immediately turns to his mentor, the geologist Sir Charles Lyell, who has supported him since his return from the Beagle voyage.
Darwin is in the biggest moral dilemma of his life. He oscillates between wanting to do the honourable thing and give Wallace his due, but also having some kind of solution to this problem.
Darwin simply threw Wallace's letter and the whole matter of what to do with it in the lap of his trusted friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker.
My dear Lyell, he has today sent me the enclosed and asked me to forward it to you.
Darwin asks Lyell to contact the botanist Joseph Hooker, a close friend for 15 years, and the man with whom Darwin first shared his evolutionary ideas.
Ink.
Hooker writes to Huxley, and together these 3 men will change the course of history.
How the hell did this happen? Frankly, I wonder it didn't happen sooner. And who's this Wallace when he's at home?
He's a collector, a commercial collector. He's been in Malaya and New Guinea for years.
Who's his agent?
Stephen.
Without Lyell, Hooker and Huxley, there may well have been no origin of species, and possibly no theory of evolution.
His observations of species on fossils, more or less feeling the pulse on the issue of evolution. It didn't provoke much of a response, but this is a development. He sees himself as a theorist.
Give us a butcher's.
Regardless of the response to his Sarawak papers, he has published.
And Darwin has not. What do you think, Tom?
When I passed those Sarawak papers on to Charles, I did warn him to put his skates on.
Thus far, it's as if someone swallowed Charles' ideas.
But he hasn't. He's come to this independently.
And Malthus. And yours. And puked them all back up fully formed. In an original way. Colic baby at the moment, pardon the imagery.
Darwin and Wallace have had a synergy of ideas.
Our friend did not find his skates.
But Wallace is an outsider. Let's face it, he has no accreditation. He hasn't done the groundwork.
Darwin has the weight of research, evidence.
If Darwin doesn't publish first, it's Natural Selection by Alfred Russel Wallace. And Charles Darwin, the nice man who likes barnacles and went on the Beagle.
He must be shattered. He told me only last month he wasn't in a rush to publish.
He hasn't got time to be shattered, nor have we. But we do have an unknown collector sitting somewhere in the jungle with his boxes of birds and gigantic snails.
Of course, Darwin wants to pursue the most honourable course. One may well ask, how many more Wallaces are out there?
I think it was a dilemma. The dilemma is that on the one hand, they are ethical people. They don't know Wallace, but they know he has done the right thing. On the other hand, he's a nobody. He is completely obscure. Their best friend, Darwin, has been working on this for 20 years. He is already a famous scientist. He has amassed a lot of information. So they justify to themselves that in the interests of science, they must publish Darwin alongside Wallace.
Darwin needs to establish priority over Wallace. He needs to write a short paper of his work to date.
He won't write short. He says it can't be done without including all the supporting evidence.
What about that essay he wrote all those years back? He could draw an abstract from that.
I read it.
Good. Let's establish his priority. Who else has read anything?
Asa Gray in America. Darwin intended on sending him an outline of the book.
Good. Good. Darwin needs to be told in no uncertain terms to publish an abstract. Now. Anything. I shall write to him.
The solution is masterful. even if Wallace, on the other side of the world, knows nothing of their plan to publish his ideas alongside those of the great Darwin. Darwin pulls together the papers his friends asked for, but time is not on their side, and the question is, how to publish? Hooker and Lyell know that a public reading, even of a brief paper, establishes ownership. But there is only one reading available before the summer break. It is at the Linnaean Society in London, one of the world's leading bodies for the study of biology.
Mr. Bennett.
Sir Charles.
But there's a problem.
Mr. Hooker. Please.
This is a paper by Charles Darwin, his first public pronouncement, and Mr. Wallace. Surely the agenda cannot be closed.
I have just put Mr. Bentham on as item number 1. His paper is a very large one as well. So sorry, Sir Charles. Mr. Hooker.
I humbly offer my services as a reader of the papers, if that would assist your decision. We'll leave these with you.
Thank you.
But Hooker's and Lyell's influence prevails. On July 1st, 1858, the Society members assemble and unwittingly take part in a moment of scientific history.
Item number 1. On the tendency of species to form varieties, and on the perpetuation of varieties and species by natural means of selection. By Charles Darwin, Esquire, F.R.S., F.L.S. and F.G.S., and Alfred Wallace, Esquire.
Charles Darwin isn't there. After years of torment, on the very day he publishes his theory that only the best adapted survive, the Darwins bury their 2-year-old son, Charles, the third child they have lost.
These gentlemen, having independently and unknown to one
Despite the pressure to set it up, the Linnaean reading is a non-event. The most challenging theory of the century is greeted with yawning indifference. But Lyell, Hooker and Huxley don't care. Darwin and Wallace have been published, and more importantly, the paper will be distributed throughout the scientific community.
Poor Em is utterly exhausted. But my name's first.
Alphabetical order by author. Excerpts from your sketch, My Wife Obliged, and the abstract of your letter last year to Asa Gray. Everyone's very pleased you wrote that. Then Wallace.
I thought my name would appear as a footnote to Wallace or some kind of appendix.
No. No.
We both must write to Wallace to explain matters. Would you mind? Perhaps you might see a way to exonerate me.
Of course.
Excuse me. Stomach. You know, Hooker, I always thought it very possible I might be forestalled. But I fancied I had grand enough soul not to care. I was mistaken. And perhaps now I shall be punished.
I need you to write a proper scientific abstract for the Linnaean Journal soon.
Darwin does eventually get a letter from Wallace. That letter's lost. We don't know what it said. And then Wallace writes a letter also to Hooker, which essentially says, look, I'm honoured. I believe that had I just been published, no one would have paid any attention to it. Darwin is the real agent of this. He's been working on it for years. He has the evidence. I don't. and they begin a correspondence where almost instantly become quite intimate friends, even though they've never met.
He knew once Wallace had published his short article in the Linnaean Society Journal, if Darwin wanted to contribute to evolutionary theory, he must publish his results. So he settled down with the long manuscript which he had already been composing, and he squeezed it into what was to become The Origin of Species.
At last, the theory he has wrestled with for more than 20 years will be written and turn Darwin into one of the most influential scientists of our time.
Reluctantly, he starts doing what he calls an abstract. It's a kind of summary, and as he does it, he catches fire.
He opens the book by recalling his voyage in the Southern Hemisphere.
And it's brilliant. It just comes off the page. It's the old Darwin from the Beagle. It's Darwin with the smell of water in his nostrils.
When on board HMS Beagle, I was much struck with certain facts. These facts seemed to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries.
At the heart of his book is the idea that since the Earth came into existence, life has been in a state of constant change.
The view of species prior to Darwin was that species were fixed. They did not change, and they were one by one created by God.
People thought that rabbits were rabbits and they never changed into anything else, shrews were shrews, squirrels were squirrels, and so on. Not only can rabbits change into something a bit different from rabbits, but given enough time, bacteria can change into humans, and that's what's happened over 3.5 billion years. That was a very, very foreign idea that Darwin had to get across.
At the beginning of the book, Darwin uses domestic pigeons as examples of change. The original rock pigeon has been modified by human breeders to produce these varieties. It's a process he calls artificial selection.
Human intervention by artificial selection could lead to enormous changes. But if the same process occurred in nature, then environmental conditions could act in the same general way as humans deliberately selecting for certain traits.
Once he's shown that humans can change domestic species like pigeons, Darwin moves on to show how nature produces even more amazing and diverse changes in the wild. Darwin believes it is achieved through a brutal and unrelenting struggle for survival.
Every being which during its lifetime produces several eggs or seeds must suffer destruction during some period of its life.
In a competitive world where there are more mouths to feed than food available and diseases to battle, some individuals survive, others perish.
Daddy! Daddy!
Through this cruel struggle for survival, Darwin sees how evolutionary change occurs. He calls it natural selection. This is what produces new species.
The whole idea of natural selection is about how individuals within a species outcompete rival individuals within the same species and reproduce. That is what drives evolution in the Darwinian model.
Whether it's sharper claws, faster legs, better camouflage, or different beak shapes, natural selection identifies and then preserves the traits which help an individual adapt better to their environment and so survive better. Over vast stretches of time, these traits add up until the descendants are very different from their ancestors. They have evolved by means of natural selection into a new species.
The beautiful elegance of a cheetah hunting a gazelle. They're both clearly beautifully honed machines, one to catch the other, one to run away from the other. This beauty, this elegance has been bought at the cost of generations of suffering gazelles, generations of cheetah ancestors who were starving to death if they didn't manage to make enough kills.
Having established natural selection, Darwin then goes on to explain the remarkable idea that all species on Earth are modified versions of what has gone before, endlessly reshaped over time by natural selection. And the evidence is there every time you look at them.
What Darwin noticed is that if you compare, say, the hand of a man, the flipper of a whale, they all have the same structure. All these creatures have their limbs, their hearts, their kidneys, their skulls, their backbones, modified from a common ancestor.
As time goes on, species evolve through natural selection to survive in new conditions. But sometimes they leave behind features that are no longer useful.
My ability to wiggle my ears, for example, which I'm doing now, I'm using 3 muscles that were in our ancestors, like cats, dogs, and horses, or species descended from them, to be able to adjust your ear to find sounds. Well, we can still do that motion, but it's useless to us.
These are from a creature unknown.
As Darwin continues, he shows how we are all linked to the past. Fossils aren't just extinct relics, but the ancestors of modified creatures still living today. In the book, he writes about the importance of the structure of the Earth, its ever-changing surface, land isolated by water, and high mountains all influence how plants and animals evolve through the struggle to survive in these environments.
Yes, just as I thought! The upper corals are dead from the sun, but the ones beneath are living!
English grasses.
As the book comes to a close, Darwin shows there's no need to invoke God to explain why plants and animals appear in various parts of the world. They arrived courtesy of winds, ocean currents, even with the help of human beings. Once there, natural selection shapes these immigrants into new species.
In their new homes, they will frequently undergo further modification and improvement, and thus they will become still further victorious and will produce groups of modified descendants.
In the summer of 1859, 13 months after he started his book, an exhausted Darwin finally lays down his pen.
Whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and wonderful have been and are being evolved.
On October 1st, proofs on the origin of species by means of natural selection are ready. The book, which Charles Darwin never meant to write, is about to be judged by the outside world.
You know, this may be a bumpy ride.
I know.
It's going to be much more than that. In the book's 502 pages, Darwin includes only a single passing line about a species which would cause him more trouble than any other.
But Darwin realized that as soon as he published on evolution, everybody would be talking about humans. So deliberately, he didn't talk about humans in the origin until right at the end, where he said, light will be thrown on man and his history. I mean, so Darwin made it very clear in the origin that humans are part of the picture. But at the same time, tactically, if you like, he wanted to get the theory out on the table first.
Mr. Darwin's forthcoming book will throw a flood of light on the geological successions of organic beings.
Among the first to support Darwin publicly is Charles Lyell, one of Darwin's oldest and most loyal supporters.
Good old Lyell. He says he bristles with pride and is going to change his own book. Now, I don't care a jot what the universal world says. This has acted like a little dram.
Even Lyell, who supported origins as it dealt with nature generally, would always stop short of including humans in Darwin's evolutionary scheme.
Why, thank you.
Lyell struggles with himself. He adores Darwin. He's fought for him and will continue to fight for him. But he cannot bring himself, initially at least, to admit that man is not of divine origins. And it was of deep disappointment to Darwin. Lyell does not come out in support of the theory in that respect. He comes out in support of Darwin's right to the theory, but he never made a full-blown conversion, and that was always a distressing thing for Darwin.
On October 2nd, 1859, the day after seeing proofs of his book, Darwin retreats to a health spa in Yorkshire to help his severe eczema and stomach problems. As he awaits the November publication, he begins a PR campaign, sending complimentary copies of the book with covering letters to friends and colleagues.
Dear Hooker, if some 4 or 5 good men came round nearly to our view, I shall not fear ultimate success. I long to learn what Huxley thinks.
And what you see is a man really, really on tenterhooks. He's extremely nervous about how this book is going to be received. He's sounding out the world, hoping, sort of agonizingly, that he can avoid the deluge to come.
My dear Huxley, I am far from expecting to convert you to many of my heresies. But if, on the whole, you and 2 or 3 others think I am on the right road, I shall not care what the mob of naturalists think.
He writes to Alfred Russel Wallace, the man who unwittingly drove Darwin to publish.
My dear sir, if you are so inclined, I should very much like to hear your general impression of the book, as you have thought so profoundly on the subject. God knows what the public will think. With every good wishes, pray believe me, Charles Darwin.
2 weeks before publication, the first review appears in the Athenaeum, an influential literary magazine. It concentrates on the one thing Darwin fears.
Lady Constance Rawley, in Disraeli's brilliant tale, inclines to a belief that man descends from monkeys. This pleasant idea, hinted in the Vestiges, is wrought into something like a creed by Mr. Darwin.
And immediately Darwin's theory was known as the monkey theory or the gorilla theory.
The worst effect of The Origin of Species, as far as Darwin was concerned, was that Victorian people started to debate whether man was a beast or a divinely endowed creature. Is man a gorilla, an animal with animal lusts, with no morality? That was the central debate that Darwin didn't want and that became the immediate focus of The Origin of Species.
If a monkey may become a man, what may not a man become? Why construct another elaborate theory to exclude deity from renewed acts of creation? Why not accept direct interference rather than evolutionary law? They have the wood ready for me, Parslow, and will tell the black beasts how to catch me.
Don't let that happen, sir.
I think if evolution had just been about fruit flies or even about dinosaurs, I think we'd all be very interested in it. But I don't think it would be quite the high-status theory it was then, and it still is now. The reason why evolution does play into crises of faith, into religious issues, is because evolution is about human beings. Where humans came from, where humans are now, and where humans are going to go. So evolution plays into the crisis of faith because it's offering an alternative picture.
4 days before publication, Darwin receives welcome support from Hooker.
My dear Darwin, thank you for your glorious book. It is capitally written and will be very successful.
And Hooker goes further, endorsing natural selection in the foreword of his landmark book about botany in the Southern Hemisphere. Huxley also pledges his allegiance.
I, for one, am sharpening up my beak and claws in readiness to tear at the curs who will soon begin to bark and yelp.
On November 24th, 1859, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection finally goes on sale in London. Priced at 14 shillings, it's an immediate hit. 1,500 copies quickly sell, and it exceeds its print run. It seems to be speaking to the age and its people.
By that time, people were starting to see that Christianity was not functioning very well, that it didn't seem to be very relevant to people in urban life. What was speaking to people was science, engineering, technology, and these sorts of things. species. And the origin of species represents that change.
The origin of species is one of the kind of nails in the coffin of Victorian self-confidence and certainty. There's the mutiny in India, the rise of America and Germany as rival powers, the sense that Britain is being overtaken. It is a moment of doubt, and the origin of species is one of the sources of those doubts.
By December, more reviews are rolling in. London's leading newspaper, the Daily News, is unimpressed.
Mr. Darwin has not brought us one step nearer than the author of The Vestiges to the belief that species are originated by any law of variation.
The Political Examiner magazine is incredulous.
The mortifying reflection that proud man may have once been an ape bat.
People who've been brought up to think that there's something unique, almost angelic, about humans feel insulted by the idea that we are animals. People feel that if natural selection is what drives us, then we're all going to be ruthless, selfish, horrible. That again threatens self-image, and it probably was that generated the hostility to the book in Victorian times.
But it's the personal attacks which cut Darwin deepest. On Christmas Eve, Darwin receives a letter from his former teacher, the Reverend Adam Sedgwick.
Because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. You have deserted the true method of induction. Passages in your book greatly shocked my moral taste. If I accept God's revelation of himself, only then we shall meet in heaven.
Let me see.
Sedgwick has a kind and noble heart. Now I know how good men become inquisitors.
Well, perhaps we'll just put it out of the way somewhere.
On December 26th, a shot in the arm comes courtesy of a review in the Times, the biggest-selling newspaper in Britain.
When he lays before us the results of 20 years' investigation and reflection, we must listen. All the principles he lays down are capable of being brought to the test of observation and experiment.
But this complimentary piece wasn't the work of the Times reviewer, Samuel Lucas.
I've no idea what to say about it.
I do, Mr. Lucas. I know what to write. I write the review under your name. You write the opening paragraph. I'll pick up on your style. You get home in time for Christmas.
This is the moment when I strenuously object on the grounds of scholarly probity.
Now we can have another drink.
Your health.
And yours.
By early 1860, Huxley has written 3 articles in defence of Darwin, but he also has his own agenda. The platform he chooses is the Royal Institution Lectures in London. Surprisingly, Darwin is there and even arms Huxley with some of his pigeons as evidence.
The fact is,
Huxley deals quickly with pigeons and variation, but his real interest is revealed towards the end of the lecture. And it alarms Charles Darwin.
And to those who watch the signs of the times, it seems clear that this 19th century will see revolutions of thought and practice.
I don't think Huxley was that interested in natural selection. It wasn't that important to him. Huxley's aim in life was to improve Britain. That in order to do this, you need people educated as scientists, as doctors, as engineers, as mechanics, and all of these things.
And how will England fare in this? That depends on how you, the public, deal with science. Cherish her. Venerate her. Follow her methods faithfully, and the future of this people will be greater than the past. Listen to those who would silence and crush her. And I fear our children will see the glory of England vanishing like Arthur in the mist.
So Huxley basically said, well, what can we do with evolution? It can be our kind of background ideology, our Christianity substitute.
Despite Darwin's disappointment at Huxley hijacking the lecture, he soon comes to realise the value of Huxley's tactics and friendship.
That vestiges taught that all came from naught by development, so-called progressive.
That insects and worms assume higher forms by modifications excessive.
The laughs don't last. On the same weekend, the Edinburgh Review arrives. It contains an anonymous critique of Darwin's book.
I am trashed in every possible way. We all three are.
The author is Richard Owen, Darwin's longtime supporter, a scientific power broker and Huxley's sworn enemy.
Wallace is Darwin's partner in crime.
Hooker is as short-sighted as his master.
He means to say that I'm incompetent. That's what he means to say. Friends for 25 years. You're right. The man is a base dog.
Darwin's shock is compounded by the fact that he'd sought Owen's opinion on his book only 2 months earlier.
That existing influence is responsible for the ordained birth of species. I could never regard your book as heresy. Good. I have some problems with some of your facts, your style of reasoning. Perhaps you could reduce the quantity of coulds and beliefs, but then it is written in your voice, of course, and therein lies its charm. I'm currently editing essays for publication, and with your permission, I should like to include something along the lines, the best attempt to answer the supreme question of zoology has been made by Charles Darwin.
Now I understand you, Huxley.
It's only when Darwin himself becomes targeted and attacked that he starts to think, I want Huxley fighting for me.
Why you have him so clearly in your sights.
This is the declaration of war, and it seems so fitting that the three of them should be reading this together. Charles Darwin knows to have Huxley at his side, he's going to be protected. More than that, he's got a hunt dog.
Throughout early 1860, the attacks increase.
It does open violence.
It adopts views that are repugnant to the most cherished feelings and hopes of man.
I think Mr. Darwin's theory is unsound.
Whatever the public success of the book, the long-expected battle with the scientific establishment has arrived. A week-long meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science is convened at Oxford University. The final session is devoted to discussing the origin of species. Expectation of a showdown is high. Running the meeting is Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford, a geologist and vice president of the association. Wilberforce is a man who regards evolution as nothing but religious heresy.
It was absolutely essential for orthodox scientists, Christian scientists, to have a complete cleavage between man, who was made in God's image as a special being, and animals, which were produced on earth to serve man.
For Huxley, pushing evolution was the way forward. For Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, evolution represented yet one more, what shall I say, breach in the cultural wall of Anglican Christianity. So I think that the debate wasn't really about the fossil record. It was really about the direction that Britain, England was going to take. And Huxley represented one side, and Wilberforce represented the other.
Keep him on a leash, will you?
The bishop is well prepared for the confrontation.
Wilberforce has been primed by Richard Owen to get at Huxley. He's been primed to attack these young Darwinists.
After speeches and reports, it's the turn of Bishop Wilberforce to take centre stage and hold forth on Darwin's book.
The facts brought forward do not warrant the theory. Evolution by natural selection is unphilosophical. There is a distinct line between humanity and animals, and it is an obvious one. Lower organisms do not become intelligent beings. Does a turnip become a man?
The real confrontation that does occur is a small passing comment made by Wilberforce at the expense of Huxley.
Mr. Huxley, please inform the gathering. Are you related to the ape on your grandfather's side? Or your grandmother's side? Or both?
The Lord has delivered him into my hands. But now you raise the matter, sir. A matter which Mr. Darwin does not raise in his book. If I must make a choice, I should be proud to acknowledge the ape over one who has received a scholastic education, who uses his logic to mislead an untutored public, who plunges into scientific questions with which he has no real acquaintance.
It is patently obvious that the Archbishop has never read the book. And those from whom he has received his coaching are ignorant. Ignorant of the rudiments of botanical science.
It's seen in retrospect as a triumph for Huxley as the leader and for the young Darwinists. They've put down the oily bishop and made him look like a creep. It immediately becomes a kind of media event, as it would do today. Newspapers record this, and they record it in mythic terms. This is the battle that's commenced between the new forces of Darwin, materialists, the ape lovers, and the bishops, the church, the science.
Dear Mr. Huxley, how dare you attack a live bishop in this fashion? Have you no reverence for fine lawn sleeves? I see that my unaided book would have been absolutely nothing.
It is a huge victory for Darwin and his supporters. His once heretical ideas are widely accepted. It heralds the beginning of the end of the old order.
People went over to evolution in their droves. Naturalists first, a lot of radicals, a lot of free thinkers, people outside the Church of England primarily, in Britain and America.
It's a bad mistake to isolate the origin of species from the culture within which it was produced. That Darwin's theory could not have been produced, as it were, before the 1850s, let's say, in the way, certainly couldn't have been the success it was before then.
But however much evolution was accepted, doubts remained about natural selection.
Many of Darwin's closest friends and most active supporters had small doubts about the way the mechanism worked.
Some people, like Thomas Henry Huxley, thought that evolution went through jumps. Others thought that there was a kind of momentum. Asa Gray, the American botanist who was Darwin's great supporter, thought that God directed the variation. Rarely, if ever, did anybody accept natural selection like Darwin did.
Darwin got it right pretty much in The Origin. We have ample evidence for natural selection. Everybody knows about it. There's 300 or 400 of them, and they all say the same thing, that it's occurring daily in nature, as Darwin said it did, and changing organisms in the way that Darwin said it would.
An example is an island off New Guinea where I worked in the late in the 1970s. This island is a volcano that blew up in the 1600s. It was colonized by two species of honey eaters, one a little bigger than the other, and over the course of the following 300 years, the big one got bigger and the small one got smaller to avoid competing with each other. That's natural selection within modern times.
Amazingly, the great debates have been happening without the co-discoverer, Alfred Russel Wallace. In 1862, after years travelling amongst the islands of Indonesia and New Guinea, Wallace sails for England.
So my voyage south has come to an end. This really is it. Thus my travel ended.
The country he returns to has undergone huge cultural and scientific changes. Changes Wallace helped set in motion alongside Darwin, the man he is finally to meet.
The theory of natural selection is as much yours as it is mine.
You have made it your own, which is as it should be.
Although a very different man to the rest of Darwin's supporters, Wallace is welcomed into the fold.
Sorry. I'm not really used to all this. So, what I noticed was that there is an unseen boundary that separates the zoogeographical regions of Asia and Australia. From island to island, completely different.
And this contributed to your consideration of species, of course.
Yes.
We should call that line the Wallace line. The Wallace line. The Wallace line.
Almost immediately, Wallace positions himself publicly as one of Darwin's greatest and best defenders.
Natural selection is the very foundation of Mr. Darwin's theory. Yet even this is misunderstood or misrepresented.
Throughout the 1860s, Wallace, Hooker and Huxley continued to campaign for Darwin's theory, despite Huxley's slight reservations about natural selection. By the end of the decade, evolution is embraced throughout the world. Charles Darwin, who never wavered in his belief of his theory, now finally has the courage to go where he had always feared.
I don't know that there's ever a moment you can say that Darwin is triumphant, but what I think we can say is that by 1870 he's determined to publish a book on the descent of man. He has written a book in which he says quite explicitly man is descended from the apes or descendants of the apes. And that really surely is the sign that Darwin has won.
It's a battle which would probably never have started, let alone been won, without the support of others, particularly Hooker, Huxley and Wallace, Darwin's fellow voyagers to the Southern Hemisphere.
These voyagers forged a bond that they recognised for the rest of their lives. They speak of each other as fellow circumnavigators. It is not a coincidence that these people became a cadre, a group of tightly knitted friends.
In the years to come, Joseph Hooker, the young botanist who worshipped Charles Darwin, eventually succeeds his father as director of Kew Gardens, then and now one of the world's greatest botanical institutes. He is still considered one of the greatest botanists in history. Until his death in 1911, at the age of 94, he remains an ardent supporter and promoter of Darwin's work.
Increased thickness in the ocular brow, here and here. Now, dissect an ape brain, a monkey brain, your brain, my brain.
Thomas Huxley becomes one of the most influential figures in British science.
Minor. We all have them.
Although director of numerous schools and colleges, evolution is never taught at any of his institutions, but he continues to preach evolution at working men's clubs and societies. Huxley eventually succeeds in toppling the crown of his arch-enemy, Richard Owen, becoming president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. He dies in 1895, 35 years to the day after he confronted Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at Oxford University. Alfred Russel Wallace is the least successful. Unlike Hooker and Huxley, he's never appointed to a top scientific position. Instead, he scrapes a living writing travel and natural history books. Always eccentric, he angers the others when he pursues his interest in fringe activities like spiritualism, and even dares to question if natural selection can explain everything about human beings. But to his dying day in 1913, Wallace remains one of Darwin's most passionate defenders. He is only saved from complete poverty when Darwin intervenes to secure him a pension. For the rest of Darwin's life, he rarely ventures from his home. Although famous, he prefers the seclusion of Down House and the company of his wife and family. Darwin writes 10 more books, including one on earthworms, his last. But none would equal the importance of On the Origin of Species.
He changed the way human beings thought about themselves. That we're just part of nature.
The Origin of Species gives me a sense of humility. Humility that I'm another species like all the others. It gives us a true understanding of our interrelatedness with other life forms.
Darwin changed the world that we live in. I mean, not only did he give us a new picture of ourselves, but of course he was a major figure in bringing science and the rule of law into our understanding of the world.
He was one of the greatest scientists who's ever lived. He provided the explanation for my existence and yours and the existence of every living creature. You can explain everything about life. Now that's a powerful idea.
Charles Darwin died in 1882, aged 73, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, thanks to the intervention of Huxley. It was the final destination in a journey that began in the Southern Hemisphere, when Darwin first glimpsed a new way of seeing our world.